I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission has just released its 2025 annual report to Congress. The annual report's analysis and recommendations are a crucial source of information for Congress, the executive branch, and observers of U.S.-China relations around the world. This year's report includes 28 key recommendations for Congress. I'm delighted to have two commissioners as my distinguished guests today to discuss the report. Commissioner Aaron Friedberg and Commissioner Mike Kuiken. Commissioner Friedberg is a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University and co-director of its Center for International Security Studies. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, counselor to the National Bureau of Asian Research, and previously served as Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs for Vice President Dick Cheney. Commissioner Kuiken is a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and advisor to the Special Competitive Studies Project. He was formerly Senate Majority Leader Schumer's National Security Advisor, was instrumental in the CHIPS and Science Act, and has over 20 years of experience shaping U.S. national security policy, including 12 years on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Welcome, both of you, to the China Global Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
So I want to start talking about the report, which has a number of chapters on some really, really crucial issues that I look forward to discussing with you both. There's a detailed account of the ways in which China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, which you refer to in the report as the axis of autocracy, and some analysts have labeled CRINC, that those countries are challenging the interests of the United States and its allies and partners around the world. So can you talk a bit about what is China's role in this axis, and can you provide a few examples of how cooperation among these countries poses threats to the United States and its allies and partners?
Well, China is really the hub of this axis. It's the most important member. In varying ways, it provides support for all of them. It's buying Russian oil, Russian grain. It's selling or transferring many of the components that Russia needs to continue to build weapons. It's buying Iranian oil and also selling them components that provide some support for North Korea as well. And those three also support each other in various ways. But China is really the center of this, both through what they buy and what they sell and what they transfer, and also through a system that's allowed other countries to evade Western and especially U.S. sanctions quite effectively in recent years.
So what is the best response from the United States and its allies? Clearly, your report will contribute to raising awareness of the activities that these four countries, the axis of autocracies, are engaged in. But what else can the United States and our allies do to protect our interests and maybe even deter those countries from taking actions that are harmful to our interests?
Well, we do think awareness is important. And one of the recommendations in this year's report is for an intelligence community review of China's support for Russia in the context of its war in Ukraine that would be both classified and an unclassified version should be made publicly available. In addition, because some of what China is doing is particularly aimed at undercutting our economic statecraft, we've recommended some structural changes in the way in which the U.S. government deals with sanctions and export controls, and in fact, the creation of a consolidated entity that would oversee all of those policies. We found that it's, in some ways, the policies being pursued are separate and not adequately coordinated. We have another recommendation, which has to do specifically with what we observe that China and Russia in particular have been doing to interfere with undersea cables. Both of them have been involved in incidents that seem to indicate deliberate efforts to cut undersea cables. So we've recommended something that we've referred to as an undersea cable initiative, banning Chinese owned ships from being involved in laying cables that the United States uses, and also coordinating international efforts to monitor the safety of those cables, and if necessary, to become involved in repairing them. So those are a few recommendations.
So I'll move on to talk about another chapter that you have in the report, which refers to interlocking innovation flywheels, that focuses on China's manufacturing and innovation policies. So what exactly is the interlocking flywheels effect, and in which sectors has China achieved the first mover advantage because of this effect?
So, Bonnie, funny story for you. When we were starting drafting process in this, Aaron actually left a note in the comments saying, "What is this?" And I said, "It's a new concept. Isn't it exciting?" And I think Aaron has since fallen in love with the idea. But the concept is basically a couple of things. Thing one, China is investing an incredible amount of money in their sort of innovation, basic science, foundational science ecosystem. Thing two, they've become a manufacturing powerhouse, from everything from chips to robots to drones, you name it, cars, electric cars even. And what we're also seeing within that manufacturing ecosystem is they're leveraging that innovation machine to also bring benefit to the manufacturing sector. And it's almost taking a flywheel that was already moving fast and making it going even faster. And so the interlocking piece of it is basically the innovation and manufacturing ecosystem are now interlocked and is just allowing them to accelerate at a rate that is sort of unseen in human history. The places where I think we see this the most, Bonnie, robotics, not only building robots, but also putting robots into the manufacturing system to have this automation. There was recently an article that I think the New York Times had where they talked about a factory floor that was totally dark, where the robots were building everything in the dark, and it was taking very few people to manufacture the things there. Electric vehicles, we're seeing it there as well. Biotech, we're seeing it there. Chips, we're seeing this happen there. And a lot of this has come at the benefit of the Chinese economy in other spaces too. And I think we're going to continue to see this happen in the coming years. But it's truly something to behold, and it's something that we need to keep a close eye on.
So some of this, of course, was really it jumped onto our radar screen in 2015 when China created its Made in China 2025 plan. And of course, that's just one of China's many industrial plans. And at the time, I remember I testified at a hearing that was held by then Senator Marco Rubio on Made in China 2025. So he brought early attention to this issue. So if we look today, 10 years later, what has changed in China's industrial and innovation policies? And I know there have been studies that suggest that Made in China 2025 was extremely effective. So what does it look like for the next 10 years?
I mean, I think the simple sort of explanation, I know you want us to keep our answers short, is we always talk about the say-do gap when we evaluate various scenarios in the foreign policy and national security space. And the Chinese did not have a say-do gap between Made in China 2015 and sort of what they said in 2015 and what they delivered in the Made in China 2025 plan. The goals that they set for themselves, Bonnie, were incredibly ambitious. And there are some places where they didn't necessarily meet the goal, but they achieved so much of what they intended that it's almost not even worth considering that piece of it. We're seeing that big time in semiconductors. Biotech, I mentioned in my last answer, Bonnie. Biotech is really interesting because the original intent of the Made in China 2025 plan was to focus on pharmaceuticals, and they've been successful there. But the benefit of what they did in pharmaceuticals is that in the entire synthetic biology ecosystem, they are beginning to accelerate their innovation there as well. So not only did it deliver, but it is delivering in sort of adjacent areas that were sort of not necessarily envisioned or planned for, but have become a benefit to the larger program.
Bonnie, could I add, Commissioner Kuiken has correctly referred to the acceleration of China's policies, and we certainly see that. One of the things that's striking also, you mentioned Made in China 2025, is the consistency with which China has been pursuing its objectives. the emphasis on technological innovation and self-reliance goes back a long way, at least to 2006. So it's striking how China has set itself on a course and stuck with it.
Yes, I think that's a very important point to make. It's not a new objective for China. It's been around for a long time. It certainly precedes Xi Jinping. So what's your short elevator speech on why it matters if China achieves dominance in some of these strategic technology areas of the 21st century? Why is this existential for the United States?
Well, if you look across the technologies that we've mentioned, some of them are likely to be the drivers of the next great wave of industrial innovation. China takes a dominant position in those sectors. It's going to gain advantage. It's going to gain global market share. It's going to enable its economy to grow more rapidly. It's going to generate more resources with which it can do all the things that it's been doing already, including building up its military capabilities. And there are some of those technologies, really, I guess all of the ones that Commissioner Kuiken mentioned, that also have direct strategic implications. The biotechnology certainly could, just as we've seen with artificial intelligence, semiconductors. These are things that have implications both for commercial developments and also for military developments. So the United States has been in the lead for several decades across a whole range of technologies. And we see increasingly that it's closing the gap. And in some areas, it seems actually to be moving ahead. And that has worrisome implications, we think, for the United States and also for the entire advanced industrial democratic world.
Bonnie, elevator speech. I'll give it to you. I'll put one word at the front of it: convergence. AI, quantum, biotech. When these three things converge, there will be an acceleration in research, almost to the point where it is possible that you unlock autonomous research. Autonomous research would have civilian benefits, military benefits, diplomatic benefits, economic benefits, and the path that they are pursuing is essentially a convergence of these key consequential technology areas to ensure persistent dominance.
So what's the appropriate policy prescription then? Is it more resources into research and development? Is it doubling down on industrial policy for the United States? How do we prevent China from taking the lead, or even places where it may have the lead now from widening that lead?
Bonnie, I just wanted to add one other thing to what you've been saying and what Commissioner Kuiken said, and that is China's policymakers have a theory, an underlying theory of what it is that's driving industrial, technological, and economic development. And they've had this for some time. And so they're not just pursuing individual policies and going after one technology or one industry after another. They see them converging. They see all of them coming together. And they regard what's happening now as something akin to the original Industrial Revolution in some ways. And their theorists see such periods when there's rapid industrial and technological change as providing opportunities for rising powers to overtake the dominant powers. So for them, this is ultimately all about power.
Commissioner Kuiken, do you want to talk about policy prescriptions?
So I hate saying more money, Bonnie, but none of this stuff runs on fairy dust. I love Tinkerbell, but there's not enough to go around. So more money is required, but it also requires sort of ongoing work between the private sector and the public sector. That kind of coordination, as we think about these strategic areas, needs to be very thoughtful. It needs to involve an analysis of where the supply chain is and where it is not, where our dependencies are, what it looks like to work with our European friends, our Japanese friends, our South Korean friends, our Indian friends, and then how are we going to sort of think about almost combining our efforts in sort of key areas to ensure that the market is available for the things that we're developing, making sure that the minds and the workforce are available to do these things. And so more money is certainly part of it, but it's also sort of a coordinated effort at the national level here in the U.S. and then thinking about what does integration of the research ecosystems in the countries that I mentioned look like. So I think that's also a big piece of it. And then, I mean, everybody that I meet these days says, "How do I get a CHIPS Act for my sector?" I mean, that's not really the answer, right? But so often it feels like the easy button. I don't think we should be doing that for every sector. I think that semiconductors. If you look around the room that we're all in right now, anything that has a switch, which is basically everything has a semiconductor, it is a fundamentally different technology than some of the other things that we've talked about already.
Two other things that I would add. One is, in addition to this applied research and focus on producing new products, it's also necessary to refresh the sources of innovation through support for basic research, basic science, scientific education. Unfortunately, we've seen some cuts in the budgets for those functions recently, and in the long run, that's going to be damaging to our prospects for competition. The other thing, in addition to the kind of offensive side of this, there needs to be better defense. We need to do more to protect technologies and innovations that are developed in this country and in those of our friends and allies from theft that China has been able to carry off over the last several decades. We need to do better at the defensive part of this.
Absolutely. So next we'll move on and talk about your chapter that's entitled China Shock 2.0. And I think everybody knows the first China shock can be traced to 2001. It really peaked in about 2010. And according to some accounts, its adverse effects really continued for another decade after that. I was recently reading a Stanford study that maintains that the China shock accounted for 59.3% of all U.S. manufacturing job losses between 2001 and 2019. And so it's really interesting that you have this chapter on China Shock 2.0. So can you explain what is this second shock? How does it differ from the first shock? And are there policy lessons from the first shock that were not adequately learned that you want to highlight, that we need to keep in mind as we prepare for China Shock 2.0?
So the first thing to note is that this is, again, not an accident. It's driven by deliberate policies on the part of the CCP regime, the money that they've pushed into manufacturing across all different sectors. They have failed thus far to do something that they've said for some years that they intended to do, namely increasing domestic consumption. So they need to sell all of this stuff they're making, and they're pushing out more and more of it. And that's partly to do also with the slow recovery that they've experienced since COVID, the collapse of their real estate sector. So this is the byproduct of deliberate policies. As far as the differences between this shock and the last one, so the first thing to note is just its magnitude. The first one was big in certain sectors. This one is enormous. China this year ran a surplus of $1 trillion, which is the biggest ever recorded, and it's likely to increase by about 30% in the coming year. So it's enormous in its volume, and also it's just extremely broad. They're pushing out exports of products at the high end of the technological and innovation ladder, electric vehicles and some of the technologies associated with those, but then all the way down to intermediate goods and basic industries, the things that they were pushing initially with the first China shock. So the last thing to say about it then, about the consequences, it has potentially damaging effects on not only the advanced industrial countries, the United States, but also across the board, particularly on countries that are trying to develop, trying to build up their own basic industries and move up the ladder in the same way that China did. So it's going to affect everybody and in harmful ways.
And once again, what are the concrete policies that you think need to be pursued by the United States to address these challenges?
Well, you asked a minute ago, and I didn't answer it, but about the lessons. And I think one of the lessons is that the existing policy instruments working through the WTO and so on simply don't work in the face of a threat of this magnitude. They're too slow. They've not been very effective. The one thing that that's really essential, and we do emphasize it in the report, is cooperation among a preferably as large a group of countries as possible, in particular coordination in their policies to defend their own markets against this flood of Chinese exports. I think without that kind of cooperation, we're not going to be successful. If the United States closes off its markets, as it's done to a certain extent, those goods are going to flow into the markets of other countries and hurt those countries, including our friends and allies. So we need coordination. We also need to have better understanding of where things are actually coming from, where the supply chains that feed into our industries originate, or where the various pieces that go into the things that we put into products that we manufacture come from, because a lot of that is coming from China. And what we've seen in the last few years is that when the United States has raised tariffs on imports directly from China, Chinese companies have managed to evade those to some extent by moving their productive facilities to other places. And that is a loophole that we have still not fully closed.
Yeah, this is really a massive problem. Since you do work in Congress and for Congress, do you have a sense as to what the political will is in both parties to implement the kind of really extensive recommendations that you've made in this area?
Well, I'm not the expert on American domestic politics. So I'll let Commissioner Kuiken tell us about that.
I am also not an expert on domestic politics.
He's a retired expert on American domestic politics.
Yeah. Listen, Bonnie, I think that there is a lot of broad bipartisan support for thinking seriously about these issues. And the NDAA nearly every year carries a series of provisions that do a lot of good work in this space. Last year, the National Biotech Commission came out with a report, and I think the NDAA is carrying a huge swath of recommendations, all focused on China. A number of ours have been in the mix as well. The outbound investment screen, biosecure. These are all things that we've been working on for a number of years. So that demonstrates to me there remains sort of a bipartisan sort of space to exist here. I think anytime you're doing policies where it's sort of saying, no, you shall not do that, or a prohibition, there's lots of support. Anytime you sort of get into the compelling industry or spending money space, things get a little more controversial. And so that area tends to be a little more complicated, and you've got to push the rock a little harder up that hill. And so, and obviously the appropriations process is not the finely tuned machine that it used to be. So there's some challenges there as well.
One other critical issue in all of this, again, is going to be cooperation with other countries. And I think there's a question, particularly given the policies that the current administration has been pursuing, of the extent to which we're going to be willing and able to cooperate with others in pursuing these common goals. And there, I think there is some daylight, and there's some reason to be optimistic on that score, partly because of the magnitude of this challenge. And also, I think the administration is, in a sense, sort of backing into a posture where it's going to welcome cooperation from others. The Treasury Secretary Bessent, in talking about China's rare earth minerals export controls, made the point the other day that this is something that's aimed at everyone, that affects everyone, and that we're going to have to cooperate with our allies in dealing with this. So is there an appetite for that cooperation? I guess the question there is more on the executive side than on the congressional side.
Yes, but I share your concerns, and I do think that should be a priority for the United States, that the magnitude of the challenges posed by China are so great that we really do need to work closely with as many other countries around the world as possible. So we'll now move to talk about the last area that I wanted to touch on from the report, which is the chapter on Taiwan. And it argues that we have entered a crucial phase of Beijing's efforts to impose sovereignty over Taiwan. And of course, China has long claimed sovereignty over Taiwan, but its military capabilities and its economic capabilities have increased its confidence that it can compel Taiwan to perhaps surrender and convince the United States that it should not intervene on Taiwan's behalf. So I agree we are certainly entering dangerous waters. Beijing is doubling down on its pressure campaign, and it is advancing towards the 2027 goal of having the capabilities to take Taiwan by force. Not a deadline, but the advancement of those capabilities is definitely concerning. So people always ask me why Taiwan matters. And so I wanted to give both of you the opportunity maybe to give me your short list of when people say Taiwan is not existential for the United States or it's not a vital interest of the United States. How do you respond?
Well, I think the effects and the significance are direct and indirect. I mean, at the moment, Taiwan's very important to us because it still is the major source for high-end semiconductors. We're doing things to try to increase our domestic capacity. But if China were somehow to take over Taiwan tomorrow, that would have enormous implications for our economy. I think it also has implications for our regional allies. So if we're still concerned about the security of countries with whom we have bilateral treaties, Japan, maybe in particular, Australia, Korea as well, they care a lot about what happens to Taiwan, even if we didn't. The Japanese, I think, have made clear that they would regard Chinese seizure of Taiwan as posing an existential threat to them in time, because it would put China in a better position to choke off their sea lines of communication. And I think just generally backing away from the commitment, as ambiguous as it's been, that we've made to Taiwan over the years would suggest to our enemies and also to our erstwhile allies and friends that we no longer have the resolve to support our international commitments or maintain the kind of global posture that we've had since the end of the Second World War. So there's a lot wrapped up in this.
I agree with Aaron that there's a lot wrapped up on it. And not so, just so I don't repeat Aaron, some of just my observations. The Chinese have been incredibly effective at essentially moving the goalposts, boiling the frog, salami slicing sort of the status quo around Taiwan over the last few years. And I think the international community has actually not done a very good job of responding. It's almost like microaggressions, which is usually a term we don't associate with these kind of things. But basically, the diplomatic community says, oh, these are things that we can handle diplomatically or through other means, and then effectively do nothing. And what the Chinese see happening is they're moving the goalposts and nothing's happening. And so, the intent of the chapter every year is to sort of shine a light on the issue, and sort of this year, I think, to sort of raise some alarms and say, folks, we have to pay attention to this issue. It's not getting better, and the status quo is not what it was 10 years ago. Aaron rightly raised the chips issue. This is obviously a vital piece of the global economy and the global innovation economy. And so Taiwan should be front of mind for policymakers in Washington.
One of the things that I'm concerned about is the growing doubts in Taiwan about U.S. security commitments to Taiwan and whether the United States would defend Taiwan. And there's been a narrative in Taiwan called the Yimei Lun. It's the being skeptical about the United States. So what do you think Congress can do to assuage those doubts and fears?
Well, reasserting the commitments that Congress has made under the Taiwan Relations Act is one way of doing that, making clear that Congress continues to strongly favor U.S. support, including military support for Taiwan. Dialogues between members of Congress and Taiwanese legislators, I think, are valuable. And also holding the administration's feet to the fire. One of our recommendations calls for the Defense Department to, I think we use the term, to show its work, to demonstrate that it's actually doing the things that it's committed to do, that Congress has authorized it to do, to support the continued development of Taiwan's military. Congress has a role in both in allocating the funds and in overseeing how those are used.
I would just pile on a few things, Bonnie. One, every time we meet with Admiral Paparo or the Indo-PACOM commander, there's certainly no blinking there, thing one. Thing two, I would say the Congress, with a huge vote, if I recall, included in the NDA 2 years ago, sort of a reaffirmation of the Taiwan Relations Act that Aaron just mentioned. And there wasn't a lot of debate, or I shouldn't say there was debate, but there was certainly not a lot of division on that issue. So there remains strong bipartisan support for it. And then the third thing I would say is that we all need to be clear-eyed about a lot of the things that go on in the sort of social media ecosystem, which is it is undoubtedly the Chinese military and intelligence services doing everything they can in the information ecosystem to drive a wedge between the United States and Taiwan. And we need to be clear-eyed about that.
Absolutely. So finally, do you think Taiwan is doing enough to bolster its own capability to deter and, if necessary, to defend against a Chinese attack? And should we be asking Taiwan to spend 10% of its GDP on defense, which is this administration's request?
Well, we're not spending 10%, so it's a little
No,
rich
we're not.
to be asking a smaller country to do that. I think we should be spending more, maybe not 10%, but we should 3% is probably not enough. No, I don't think Taiwan is doing enough. I don't think we're doing enough, but they're doing quite a bit. And they're doing more of the kinds of things that we've been urging them for years to do. And in particular, to place somewhat less emphasis on sort of last generation large platforms, manned aircraft, surface vessels, even submarines, and more on acquiring smaller, less expensive, but as we've seen in Ukraine, potentially very effective precision guided munitions to defend themselves. So it seems to me they are moving in the right direction.
I want to thank you both, Commissioner Friedberg, Commissioner Kuiken, for joining us today on China Global. Congrats on the publication of yet another terrific annual report. And I look forward to seeing the discussion about your policy recommendations in various circles in Congress and in the think tank community. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie. Appreciate it.